Morning, friends. How are we? Thanks for coming out. Oh, stop that. So this is the first ever Splendour Saturday morning book club, which is really awesome. Look, here, all the nerds are coming in now. Come on, nerds. Yay, nerds. I'd like to begin by acknowledging and paying my respects to the Arakwal people of the Bundjalung Nation on whose land we meet today, and pay my respect to elders past, present and future. So over the next 90 minutes, we're going to talk about books. Generally, we're going to talk about the books that brought us back to life. We're going to talk about words and writing and art because books are great. We're going to have some fat beats in the background from another stage that I hear someone setting up. My name's Marieke Hardy. For 11 years, I was a panellist on the first... Well, it was called the First Tuesday Book Club, and then we moved to Sunday, so they just called it the Book Club, and then we moved back to Tuesday, but it remained the Book Club. Anyway, I was a panellist... And I realised when researching this morning that it's much easier to be a panellist and get to be a smartass when someone else is hosting. Hosting is fucking hard. Anyway, so Jennifer Byrne usually hosts, but this time I get to host, so I'm in the grown-up chair. I'll introduce all the people that will be speaking about books this day. Maybe I'll start... This is not the order that I wrote down. And Sarah, can I start with you? This is Sarah Ferguson. Bit of a clap. It was great. Who's an investigative journalist, began her career in newspapers in Britain, writing arts reviews for The Independent before moving to France, where she worked for the BBC. She's worked for Dateline and Insight as a reporter and producer. Just won a gold Walkley, no big deal, whatever, it's fine. For her work on Four Corners Investigation, Our Bloody Business into Cruelty to Animals in Indonesian Abattoirs. She's got a new book out. And in 2015, she presented the critically acclaimed Hitting Home, reporting from the front line of Australia's domestic violence crisis. That won Best Documentary at the ACTA Awards. And another Walkley. There's a lot of Walkleys. Sarah Ferguson, thank you. No, you can't shush. It's Splendour. You've got to go, ooh, ooh. That's how we do it. Alex Lahey, sitting to Sarah's right. Australian singer-songwriter. Now you get to see where I found your bios from. See if you can guess. 2016, Lahey won the Josh Pike Partnership. Her track, You Don't Think Like People Like Me, received Pitchfork's Best New Track Award and was featured in the Triple J Hottest 100 of 2016. Did you have a pool party when that was happening?
I was recording my record when that was happening.
So did someone have to call you and go, you're in it?
Yes, yeah, it sort of worked that way.
Oh.
It was very nice though. It was very encouraging.
Yeah. That's exciting. In 2017, Alex released her debut album, I Love You Like a Brother, which Spin Magazine said was one of their 13 favourite overlooked albums of 2017.
It's a bit of a backhander,
isn't it? Isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in there,
I didn't overlook it.
Oh, thanks.
Oh, thank you, Sarah.
It's just bollocks.
And I also found this, Alex. Alex enjoys cats, Cooper's Sparkling, her blue 1999 Corolla, Alan's Party Mix, fuzz pedals and soft poached eggs. Are all those things true, Alex?
Yeah, except I sold the Corolla.
Shit. Okay.
The Rolls Royce is no longer with me.
Rolls Royce.
Yeah.
Nice.
How much did you get?
Someone got really ripped off.
Actually, they're here.
Yeah, shit, they're after me.
To my left is award-winning Australian director Patrick Nolan, who's the artistic director of Opera Queensland, prolific director of opera theatre, physical theatre and large-scale outdoor events, as well as the former artistic director of internationally acclaimed company Legs on the Wall. In a career spanning nearly 3 decades, he has directed for many of Australia's performing arts companies and internationally for Seattle and New Zealand Opera. Please give a round of applause to Patrick. To my right, someone who asked me to call him the mayor, which I'm yet to fact check.
Unofficial.
He's unofficial mayor, Paul McNeil, who lives and works in Byron Bay. His art lives on in album covers, books, posters, shirts and surfboards. He's a collaborator working with everyone from the Beastie Boys and Sonic Youth to lifestyle brand Mambo. I didn't know they were calling themselves a lifestyle brand. Are you a part of that choice?
Pre-lifestyle.
Oh, pre-lifestyle.
Can I just say that you said living on does suggest he's dead?
Yeah, that's it.
Are you dead? You're not
Who
dead,
writes
are
this
you?
stuff?
This is
Yeah.
the internet. You might need to check that. He has written and illustrated 3 kids' books and runs the art department at Splendour. So you're in him at the moment. He's been here since Tuesday. Yeah, working hard. A round of applause for Paul, please. And finally, to my far right, Broden, you'll like where I've pulled yours from. Broden Man-Beast Kelly. Are you called that in every internet bio of you?
Legally, yeah.
Yeah, Broden Manbeast Kelly is a writing performing member of Aunty Donna, host of the Aunty Donna podcast. He attended the University of Ballarat where he formed Aunty Donna with Mark and Zach. He was born to Wayne, is it Leone?
Leone, yeah.
Leone Kelly.
Where is this from?
Never you mind. Thorough research.
My Facebook or something?
I'm my own four corners right now. Round of applause for Broden, please. So I'm going to start by asking you all about your first experiences with books and reading and how they came into your life. I'll start with you, Broden. We'll go round this way. Do you remember your first experience and memory of books?
Yes. I'm going to talk about one of the books in particular, but it was the first. Yes. This is about books.
Books generally. I did send you these questions
not
in
read a
advance. I did. But do you remember, were your family big readers? Were you did you read comics as a kid? Were you a TV kid? Or?
I was always afraid of books because I don't know. I've met a few people similar as I've gotten older, but I was always afraid of sitting down and dedicating a long amount of time. I came through the age where you could watch a television show, and that was most of how I took things in. So when I started to read books, I felt like it was a really rewarding experience and a very personal experience.
And what age were you when that happened?
28. I was probably the first book I ever finished was I was 11 years old, and I had a cold, and I read the book from start to finish.
What was the book?
It was The Rock Says the Rock Autobiography.
Okay, there we go.
With
And
WWF superstar.
were Wayne and Leone big readers?
Yeah, my dad talked a lot about his favourite book ever is the Michael Caine biography. The Michael Caine biography, and he talks, and the big reader. And his favourite movie is The Italian Job.
Oh, I'm glad we're learning a lot about Wayne Kelly today.
Yeah. And my mum my mum is going on the trip of her life later in the year. She's obsessed with the Brontes, and she's going to all through England and living her dream of going to see where they hung out. So
that's a beautiful nerd dream.
Yeah,
I like that.
She's very much of that, and she loves Mr. Darcy and everything.
Oh,
so,
okay.
and she actually she got into Bendigo University and to become a writer, and at the last minute panicked and didn't go. So and instead went off and did other things and became a mum. And my whole life has been her going, I wish I was a writer, so do whatever you want. And that's
And you
true.
did Aunty Donna
Yeah.
to make her proud.
And so my thing will be don't be a writer, go be a banker. That will be to my children.
Paulie, what's your first experience of books and reading?
Well, I guess, school, Jack and Jill and all those sort of childish books you read, but, you learn from. But I think I thought about this a lot, and being a visual person, comics just became a big part of my life, and I think they probably did for most people, but or boys at least, but cartoons and comics, and I just couldn't get past the visuals and the colours and the ideas. I thought it was great that grown men and women were writing these things that was aimed at children and just churning them out and putting a lot of love into them, and the idea of those little frames telling little stories over a short time. And so that was a big part of my life, comics, and I just couldn't I'd read anything, Donald Duck, anything you get your hands on, Jughead, Riverdale, which has become that. But I remember once I broke my leg and a neighbour brought over, I was, on a couch for months and weeks, and a neighbour brought on a whole box of Phantom comics, and I think they were kind of old and musty, and Phantom was like 50s or 60s thing, was already old, but I started watching them because I started reading them because I'd read every other one. But they were just, Phantom was so full of humanity and social problems and world problems and living in the jungle and not wanting to kill people and good and evil. And it was like, it really confused me, but also realised that someone was trying to say something more than, bang, bang, pop, pop. It was quite overwhelming, and there's a lot of, graphic novelists and stuff that sort of apply that now, and I think that was a good starting point for me.
Do you read modern Phantom? When people have been accustomed to the original, do you feel like the new series maintains it?
Well, I stopped reading comics pretty much, but...
That's sad.
Well, I've had lots of other fun things to do, but I remember the Phantom movie came out, and that sort of kind of ruined it all for everyone. But Billy Zane.
Is that Billy's?
He's amazing. But there's been the Dark Knight, the Phantom was the Batman was sort of readdressed in a very dark way by Frank Miller, and it was just like that turned into the Batman movies that were quite pivotal, and they're gone from the corny Batman from the 60s to this really the Dark Knight. It was quite interesting where comics and so forth went and are going, and all we have now is adaptations. Thor of Marvel. It's just a huge genre.
Yeah. I'm going to... Patrick, do you remember in terms of memories of books and reading when you were a kid?
Yeah, I was the youngest of 4. I had 3 older sisters who all had lots and lots of books. And so I think the first book I ever remember reading was Fish Out of Water, which is about a boy who gets a goldfish and is told not to feed it too much. And he does. And it grows and keeps growing and growing until it ends up in the public municipal pool. And as it's like, so the fish is as big as this tent, basically. And then Mr. Carp has to turn up. And Mr. Carp turns up with a little box this big, and he dives into the pool with the fish and comes back out with the goldfish at the right size.
How did he do that?
Oh, you never know. That's the mystery of the novel. And it's a beautiful book. Yeah, and I had goldfish at the time, and so they all died because I overfed them. Because I really wanted my goldfish to be as big as the municipal pool. Anyway, so that was my first experience of books. And then probably cartoons after that. Asterix and Obelix were,
that was so great.
Really big in my childhood.
Did you, speaking of, because I was really big on Asterix and Obelix as well, and it was Goscinny and Uderzo, that's right, and one of them did the text and one of them did the drawings, and either one of them died or they split. I feel like one of them died, and the other one took over with their son and did both, and it was the artist and the text, because remember, it was so full of great puns.
Yeah.
And the text was terrible, and you realised how clever that writing was and that they needed to write together in order to make that work.
Yeah.
Alex, what about you as a kid?
I actually started reading at a unusually young age. So I suppose I kind of peaked a bit too soon, and it's been downhill ever since. But yeah, I remember I have a memory of being in bed and reading out loud, because when you're a child, you don't know how to, you have to verbalise everything. And I remember my mum sort of coming into my room, she's like, "What are you doing?" I was like, "I'm reading." She was like, "Right." And I remember I was reading, there's a hippopotamus on my roof eating cake. Classic. And I remember my mum sort of being a bit confused by the fact that I was doing that. And I suppose I probably wasn't reading. I'd probably just memorise the story from being told it so many times, and was able to link the narrative to the images in the book. But from then I just sort of really had a huge passion for reading and for literature. And it's really funny because my parents both have are very, very passionate about books. And no one in my family is a musician. So it's really interesting, and I think that there might be a link between that and my job. And it's I think that they kind of go hand in hand and foster each other.
Was there a book, with your parents being passionate readers, you know how when you're a kid and you're a big reader and your parents are big readers and you go through their collection and you find books that are perhaps out of your age range? Do you remember anything in your parents' collection that you pored over?
My mother is actually, she's from Egypt. She's Greek Egyptian, and English is her second language. And the first ever book that she read start to finish in English was The Lion, Witch and the Wardrobe. And so that has a very sort of special place in my family. Yeah.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, it's a good one. Yeah, it's better than it could have been a really crap book. But luckily it was a good one. Yeah.
Did you ever read the sequel to The Hippopotamus on the Roof Eating Cake?
What's it called?
I think it was on top of a car.
Yeah. I think he ate a lot of cake in a lot of different places. Yeah. I think he might have ate one on holiday.
For me, it was a letdown for me.
Yeah.
I could believe the house.
Yeah.
But a car.
Have you also read the sequel to Lion, Witch and the Wardrobe?
No.
It's pretty shit too, yeah.
Right. Breaking down the myths here. Sarah, what were your memories of reading as a child?
But the first thing that strikes me about what you two said is that one of you had a cold and one of you had a broken leg. And the thing about reading as a child that I'm sure you two know is the intensity of it, and it took those moments of being confined to turn you two into readers. I came from a big reading household, but that experience, the intensity of reading as a child, I think it's almost impossible to get it back again. I've read all my life, but the moments I remember like those, and like your confinements, as they used to call it in the 19th century, it is that sense of excluding everything else from your life, shutting out everything. I remember being on holiday in particular and lying on my bed, usually somewhere hot, although I lived in England for most of my childhood. We would be somewhere hot, and instead of going outside and doing all the things that would be fun to do, lying inside that reading cocoon and living inside books. And that singularity of reading as a child is so glorious, and has always made me think that the greatest job in the entire world has to be being a children's book writer. Because the gift that you give in that moment to the imagination and the enclosed cocoon of the imagination is, I don't think, equalled at any other time in our lives.
There's a feverish quality to it as well, and maybe when you talk about heated cocoons, I start thinking about that. But that obsession that we have as a child, well, the bookish kids, when you take the torch with you under the covers to continue the book, or you keep reading in the car even though it's going to make you vomit and you don't care because you have to finish Pippi fucking Longstocking. Yeah. And you lose that as an adult. You nod off or you're sleeping in bed.
Or there are too many other things that you're thinking about. You can still have moments of intensity reading, but that particular intensity I don't think returns. For me, it was Flat Stanley. Flat Stanley was a guy who became flat. I don't even remember how he became flat, but once he became flat, life was good because he could be posted places or get under doors. And Flat Stanley, and I made the mistake of giving it to my own children. This terrible, how many mistakes do we make with our children? I give them Flat Stanley and they didn't get it.
Wasn't Flat Stanley just flat? Wasn't that the whole thing?
Was he always just flat?
He was
something
just flat.
fell on him.
Did something fall on him?
I don't know.
Something fell on him, and then he
became flat.
He solved
flat.
a crime.
Did the world fall on him?
No, it was like a cupboard or something, I think. And it feels like we've got overfed goldfish and cupboards falling on boys whose life gets better once they're flat. I feel like there are some mixed messages in the children's books we all read. Well, I do want to go on to, we're talking a lot about that feverishness that we read as children. And there is a kind of fork in the road moment when you're an adolescent. And high school, I think, tends to separate the readers from the non-readers. Was high school, Broden, you came to reading late. Were you all voracious readers in high school, or did you give it up to go to the discotheque?
You couldn't get me out of the discotheque.
But he always had a book in the corner.
Always had a book in my pocket.
Can't have it all.
It was the Bible. No. I remember having to read books for Year 12 and being really pissed off about it because I wanted to go to
the discotheque.
The discotheque, and one of them being Accidental Tourist, Generals Die in Bed, and did that get a laugh? Generals Die in Bed, the hilarious book about World War One, and I got forced to read books at high school, and one of them being Sense and Sensibility, having huge effects on me because they weren't, being a bit of an ADD kid, books weren't something. Whenever I was forced to read them, it was always a really, it was like medicine, but a great reward. I always felt.
Oh, so you enjoyed it in the end?
Yeah,
Yeah, does it take, because high school you do tend to, you study some classics. The Accidental Tourist is a great book, but does it drain the joy out of books when you have to study them in high school?
I think anything you do in high school is kind of a drag, isn't it? Anything they make you do is not that enjoyable, but they're kind of forcing you. I don't know. Would we be choosing other books if they didn't present them to us in high school? I don't wonder.
Well, if you don't get exposed, it's the way to expose people to whole swathes of literature that they wouldn't pick from the shelf if they were picking from their parents' shelves. So it's a bit like, the sort of colonic irrigation. You just feel better, it's good for you, it doesn't sound nice, but in the end it's good.
I was talking to a friend about The Great Gatsby the other day, and
what a segue.
And he wasn't sure about one of the characters or what their history was, or I think it was how Gatsby made his money. And he went online, and the first Google search shows up with essay, what to write in your essay for Great Gatsby Year 12. Oh. So there's a great community of 16-year-olds out there
cheaters.
just taking, copy-pasting.
And maybe that's what drains the pleasure out of reading, is that you have to write essays about it in high school rather than just being able to read for the joy of reading.
Yeah, but would you come to those classics as a 15, 16-year-old otherwise? Maybe
Probably
eventually.
not, unless your household's, well read and
Yeah.
has a good library.
In terms of those books, and it's often there are characters. I mean, I talked about Pippi Longstocking before, who I of course related to very much as an 8 or 9-year-old. Are there characters that spoke to you specifically in adolescence? There were the characters in books or settings in books that you like.
I don't know about an adolescent, but as a child, like pre-high school, I really felt an affinity to Matilda by Roald Dahl. And I don't really know why, but I really enjoyed school and I really enjoyed studying literature at school. And and I feel that, like, for some reason I just felt that she was probably like the first other person that I'd ever been presented with as a human being that I felt that I could relate to. And that was like a really nice experience to have. And also the movie was really good too.
Did you see the musical?
I haven't seen the musical, actually.
It's really good. Has everyone else seen the music? Has anyone else seen the musical?
Yeah.
It's really good.
I've heard
yeah,
good things.
great. Thanks, Annie.
But yeah, I think that was the first time that I ever like really connected with a fictional or any sort of character for that matter.
Did you feel like? Oh, sorry, go on.
No,
Sarah.
I was just going to say, so my response, it's slightly different, which is it's not the characters, although I loved the characters that I was reading all the way through adolescence and so childhood, adolescence and later. Lots of characters, but I never, when I think about that question, it's not a character that I identify with. I think the thing I identified most with is the quality of the prose and the poetry. So I love the characters, but I didn't feel like they were me or I was talking to them in a particularly personal way. What transported me was the poetry of the language. So I learnt lots and lots of it because those moments captured in poetry, whether I'm talking about a prose book or an actual poem, I learnt them, they stayed with me. They stayed with me in good times and bad times, and they're places to go when you can't express what's happening to you, and they still do. So for me, it was the language above the characters.
That's very true.
Yeah.
I remember I never really related heavily to any character, but I had a huge affinity and connection with Andy Griffiths as a writer, and how rebellious he almost seemed with his books. But I Am Sam, See Sam Run, just these massive pages of massive text, as if he was saying, I'm writing a book in a different way, and the teachers think you're reading a big book, but it's actually just this silly thing. Like, I love that. And Andy Griffiths, I think, and the way he wrote and the naughtiness of him.
I feel like I saw a photo of him at an Aunty Donna show
He
recently.
came. So
how was that for you?
I was like, I love this naughty man, and now I'm a naughty man. I do sketch comedy and be naughty. I fell through the floor there last night
they
doing a
fixed
show.
the floor. It's
and
fine.
and then the naughty man who was one of the reasons I'm a naughty man came to the show, and it was very, very. He came twice actually.
Did he?
Yeah.
That must have been pretty amazing.
It was strange because I didn't know what he looked like, and I was like, "Who's this 55-year-old man getting a photo after the show?" And then he tweeted, "Oh my God, you're one of
So
the
you
reasons I read."
So
but
you didn't know.
you're so lucky because how many times do we read about the people whose books we love and find out that they're fucking assholes?
Yeah.
Because so
I thought
many
you were
of
going to
them
say
were.
fucking dead.
Well, they
And
are.
that's sad
Many,
as well.
many of them
Yeah,
are
yeah.
also selfishly dead, but also awful.
Yeah, he punched me as he left, so it was a bit of a prick.
Okay.
Have people here met their literary heroes, and has it gone well or badly? Yes.
Shakespeare, Dickens,
Oh, you've
Jane
met
Austen.
Shakespeare.
Met them all.
Shakespeare, what an asshole that guy
Arsehole.
was. Yeah, selfish.
It's just me. No,
So,
I haven't.
You're talking about influence in your teens and so forth. I remember being Catcher in the Rye at school. They're going, "You need to read this," and I was going, "Oh my God, it's going to be bad if they're making us read it." But I remember absolutely identifying with it. Someone was like, "Wow, they've given us a book that I can totally relate to and beautifully written." And little moments like that, Sarah, that you were talking about, that actually do change your adolescent life somewhat.
Does anyone else have I feel like every person, a lot of people, everyone read of Mice and Men at school, and everyone has that. No one ever forgets the end of the story. It stays with people their whole lives. I remember reading in year 8, and my dad saying, "Oh, Lenny, oh," like it's something that stays with people forever. That really
Yeah.
jarring. It
Yeah.
scarred people for the last decades, a century.
I posted on Instagram not that long ago a cover of a book I was reading called A Little Life.
Yeah.
And
Oh boy.
well, yeah, right?
Yeah.
And I like posted the cover of it and like people were responding like, put it down, don't even do it, don't go there. And I was like, what the... Yeah, don't do it, yeah.
So,
Well, let's talk about that. Have you finished it?
I finished it, yeah.
And you would not recommend that people
No,
read it?
I would recommend it. I think it's a beautifully written book. I think that you need to be in a certain headspace to do it.
Yeah.
And it was, I mean, I'm like a very openly like queer person. Or I'm like gay. And like for me, like you sometimes, well, especially like growing up gay and also like even as an adult, you don't really get much of a reflection of yourself in the media and in books and in television and in film. And so like for me, it's really special to have that. And and I mean, it's really sad though.
It's a punishing book to read. I know there were some people nodding with trauma eyes in the audience, so I know they've read it. Have you read A Little Life?
I haven't read it because I went through a little period for a couple of years where lots of people very close to me died, and so I just dropped fiction. I kept all the poetry that existed in my head, but I stopped reading fiction, and that is the period when that came out. And
Why did you stop reading fiction when people died?
Because the sadness that I was experiencing, I didn't want to read about intense emotions. I wanted to read about factual things that I could process in a very straightforward way that were part of history that might engage my intellectual brain but didn't require me to engage emotionally because I was done in and exhausted emotionally, so I stopped reading fiction completely.
See, for me, like when I'm on tour and it's like my days are so rigid and you just are, you are where you're supposed to be at any given time and that's just the way it is, I read so much fiction. It's interesting, like it's almost like the binary of that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm the same. When I'm in an emotionally complex place, actually, fiction helps me to understand the complexity of it.
So I only read, when I'm in that place, I only read poetry. And just to loop back to where we were before, about people you know, when I was a child, when I was a teenager, I used to write to Philip Larkin. And
did he write back, Sarah?
He did. Now, I should point out that I used to write to everybody. I wrote to Dexy's Midnight Runners and got my first ever backstage pass, the best ever backstage pass of my entire life, and was able to take my older brother backstage. Oh, brilliant.
Genius.
He's never recovered from how cool I was when I was 12. It ended there, but anyway. But I wrote to Philip Larkin, and I used to write... So Philip, I'm sure you all know Philip Larkin, but, pretty dark, right? So he's at his library in Hull writing his dark, sad, intense poems. And I'm a teenager living in the home counties of England playing tennis and people with ponies, right? So our worlds are quite far apart at this point. Dear Mr. Larkin, I'm writing to ask why on earth it is you say that life is so miserable. It seems to me that it's really great. So I would write these long, silly letters to Philip Larkin, and he would write back little one-line answers. I refer you to this poem where I explain that life is absolutely awful, and you'll find out later. And so it continued. So instead of having pictures of Paul Weller on my wall like all my friends did, I had letters from Philip Larkin on my cork board.
That is so magic.
Do you still have those letters?
Thereby hangs a tale. When I left England... my mother, being a tidying out type of person, tidied out all my stuff because she had this extraordinary notion that everybody should live in and be loyal to the present. That is, to not live in the past and to sentimentalise some other period of your life. Quite a rigorous approach, loyal to the present. So she cleaned out my bedroom, cleaned out my chest of stuff, which included
Oh my God.
my whole teenage correspondence, including my poems from Philip Larkin. I love my mother, but I never forgave her.
And Dexy's Midnight Runners?
I don't have it either.
God. That's in fan mail to authors, because I wrote to Bill Bryson and David Sedaris and got letters back, which made my life. Have any of you ever written to, literary idols or otherwise? And
I wrote to Viv Albertine.
Yep.
Her book came out, her first novel came out. I was a big fan of The Slits. And I just related to her book incredibly a few years ago. I went, my God, we're the same age, but it's like she was a woman living in the counties or wherever it was, Brighton and so forth, troubled marriage and stuff, completely polar opposite of me living in Byron Bay, going surfing. But It's like, man, I related to your book. She wrote me back. It was really...
She did write back?
Yeah, it's great. We've written a couple of times since.
Did it get
good.
thrown out by someone?
Well, it was,
it
it was on an
traumatic?
email. So
Okay.
but I took a screen grab of it.
Yeah, that's nice. Great.
Not really. The only person... I might lose my cool factor, but I wrote to Alison Croggan, a theatre reviewer in Melbourne, and to discuss the Removalist, David Williamson's play. And that's the only... And she wrote back, and I was like, oh! This is a theatre reviewer in Melbourne who reviews plays, and she did it well. And I was at drama school, and was asking about... That's it.
She won the prize as the best international.
She's a great
critic,
reviewer.
Actually,
Yeah.
she's a very great reviewer.
Am I-
So there you
You're
go.
still cool.
I'm
don't
cool
worry.
again.
Am I allowed to say that
Yes.
I'm the worst theatre reviewer ever? Can I
Yes,
just
you
volunteer
can,
this? My
please.
very, very first job was writing theatre reviews for The Independent at the Edinburgh Festival, and I always used to have a problem staying awake after lunch. So I would go and see these plays, and they weren't the good plays, they were the plays that I got because I was the most junior person. And every time I went to the theatre at that period, I used to go to sleep. And then I'd write the review.
Oh. How did you cobble it together?
Not well.
With a web of lies?
With a web of lies.
Oh my God. When did they stumble upon your ruse?
No, I moved on before they caught me.
Oh, nice. Alex and Patrick, any fan mail?
Are you liars?
When I was in primary school, I wrote to Emily Rodder and got a letter back and a signed bookmark, which is pretty sweet.
Signed
Yeah.
bookmark.
Nice.
That's
Yeah.
exciting.
That was pretty cool. I was pretty heavy into Del Toro Quest as a child,
Yeah.
so yeah,
Oh, yeah,
it was
that's good.
Yeah.
Patrick, any fan mail? Oh.
I don't know. Why?
Have you received any fan mail?
No.
It's very easy to reach out to people now as well. Like when you were writing, it was
Yeah.
you really had to want to speak to someone, but you can,
Yeah.
all it takes is
Letter, post
Yeah.
office.
we could message anyone right now if we wanted.
Who should we
It
do?
must have
Let's
been
do
a
it.
challenge for you
Yeah.
to get dresses and stuff, was it?
Well, he worked at. It was well known that he worked at Hull University, so it was Philip Larkin, the library, Hull University.
I remember because David Sedaris typed his letter back to me because back then he was still using a typewriter. And I can't remember how I found his address. It must have been just publishers or something.
Maybe, yes,
But it
yeah.
seemed like the right thing to do.
Yeah.
We talked a little bit before we touched upon, Sarah, you avoiding fiction in times of grief, and I guess, Patrick, you leaning towards it. I did want to talk about how we turn to art in times of crisis, and if there are any particular, it doesn't have to be books, but any movies or pieces of music or anything that's helped you navigate any particular challenge in your life?
Well, I don't stop listening to music, and I think that always some sort of complex thing going on in my head, and you can pretty much, like coffee or alcohol, you can sort of set your day and mood and stuff by music, and you can direct it in any direction, you know, bring yourself down or give yourself a kick or all those things. So I'd just say music continually. I play it all the time. So I think music's a great one that people perhaps don't even acknowledge that heavily, that is sort of a constant in our, in mine particularly, but a constant in our life, you know, from radio, and we just have music and we perhaps don't acknowledge that it's so mood setting.
Do you have specific, you know how people have their heartbreak playlist or their get out of bed playlist? Do you have, or do you just
Well, it's funny,
go?
Sarah was talking about that, where I actually had heartbreak times, and I used to, you know, the T-shirt that says "Sad music makes me happy." I sort of stopped doing that because it can be maudlin, listening to a lot of maudlin music, and you can really send yourself down a hole if you want. But I have, you know, Neil Young always makes me happy. Just people with quality like that, or Bob Dylan. You know, it's like dig deeper. I'm sure, you know, authors and so forth, that you like things as you mature. You just go, wow, these people really got it. You know, just you know, very concise lyrics and you know, great music, and you know, Brian Eno or jazz, Bill Evans, music that just can help you work to, really.
What about you, Broden? Anything helped you through a time of crisis?
I feel like with my comedy group, it's a small business, and whenever I feel like it's overwhelming or I'm stressed, or if I always go back and read one of Stephen Fry's books, and usually More Fool Me, just because the man is so comfortable and easy to listen to, and makes me feel like everything's going to be okay. And you can read him forever and ever and ever and never stop. So any of Stephen Fry's books, particularly More Fool Me.
That's really interesting that he makes you feel everything's going to be okay, because
Yeah.
his life is quite difficult.
Half
I
the
mean, he
book is
suffers
about-
a lot of trauma.
Yeah, half that book is about him with cocaine and
Yeah.
I think that but he's also just he's such a Renaissance man and
He's a sweet genius, isn't he?
yeah and yeah, he's been through everything and makes me feel like everything will be okay. Just a very comfortable. He's like a warm.
Have you met him?
Never. No.
How would you do? You think he'd be?
I would just
nervous
say
or
hello and then let him do the rest. I imagine. He's a
Okay.
big talker.
Be effusive.
Yeah.
What about the rest of you in times of crisis? Any particular art? Patrick, you know, theatre?
Opera? Yeah, well, actually, yes, but I will share a story in a minute. But just picking up what Paul says about the sad songs, one of the great experiences of my working life was working with Archie Roach. And I visited him in Renmark, just outside of Adelaide, where he was living at the time with Ruby Hunter, his partner, who has since passed on. And we were working on a big concert that Ruby and Archie were doing together, and Archie said that the greatest secret that he had as a singer was he got from Hank Williams, which was to sing a sad song happy and a happy song sad. And if you listen to Archie's music, you can really hear that. And if you listen to Hank's music, you can hear that too. But in terms of crisis, yes, probably one of the darkest periods of my life was our first child was stillborn, which was, you know, it doesn't get much darker than that, I guess, in some ways. And at the time, I was directing an opera, which is called Dido and Aeneas, which is one of the great English operas. By Purcell, and it's all about grief, basically. The whole arc of the narrative is about this older woman falling in love with a younger man who abandons her, and to revenge him, she burns herself and all the other women in her town. Yeah, it's opera. You know, it's usually pretty.
And did you find working
anyway,
on that?
Yeah, and in the process of working on that, and because the music is so exquisite, it helped me come to terms with my own grief, and sort of helped me make sense of what is otherwise, you know, a completely nonsensical.
Well, you really
thing.
threw yourself right into the middle of it. Was there any point where you thought, I don't think I can do this, I don't think I can work right now, or was there no question of it?
Well, there's no question of it because I had to pay the rent, but. No, it was actually a salve. It actually helped, you know, in the process.
And that makes me think, Sarah, of your recent book on Mother, where you're writing about your mother's passing, and in doing so you discovered that negligence at the hospital led to her death. How important was the writing process for you in terms of that catharsis and the grief?
So I didn't picture it as being that. I didn't identify it in advance. And I should just say, to bring in the broader question there, that it's true that I didn't read any fiction during that period, but I did speak a lot of poetry to myself. So I couldn't go to music. I couldn't listen to Purcell at a time like that, or any of the music that I love. But I have so much poetry in my head that I learnt when I was young, that there are endless moments of intense feeling in poetry that I can use to make me feel better. So rather than music that I found too intense in those moments, I find great comfort in the knowledge that thousands of people for thousands of years have been through exactly the same thing and have found ways of expressing it. So either Shakespeare or a lot of Keats, a lot of Wordsworth, those are the things. And I would walk around quoting to myself, repeating the same poetry lines over and over again, and that helped. Now, someone asked me to write a little book about my mother dying, and it's very unusual for me to write about or talk about anything personal because I'm a journalist and I loathe brand journalism, the journalism of our time that makes you the person that matters when it's not me that matters, it's only the work that matters. So to write about something personal was very unusual. But I said yes because for that one moment, my relationship with my mother was a good one. And I thought my entire working life is about hardship, people who've been through extraordinarily difficult things, great crises in the world, and that this is one simple good thing that I know about, a mother's love, and so I can write about it. I had no idea that in being asked to do so, I was being given the most precious gift, which is to enable me to write about something sad, but with something sad that's also tinged with a sort of sweet regret, if you like, because there were no issues, there was just love. And to write about that meant that I could think about it, formulate those ideas into prose. And now I have this little jewel of a thing that we all get something from our mothers, a thing. If we're lucky, we get something to hold on to. And I have 10,000 words to hold on to that will be part of my love for her and hers for me forever. So how lucky was I?
Very lucky. Do you feel, given your self-protection in terms of how much you share about yourself, do you feel comfortable that a document that vulnerable exists in the world?
Yes, although it's a strange thing. If I'm talking about work in any way or anything else that I've written, I could talk about it all day, and I'd be happy to talk about the work that I do in relation to the work or the book that I've written before. But in this case, I find I can only speak about it once a day. That if I do it more than once, it starts to feel like I'm selling it or cheapening it in some way.
It becomes a story.
Becomes a story or a commodity. So once a day is enough, but actually it's extraordinary. I find myself going back and rereading little sentences of it, and it gives me so much pleasure. So lucky.
That is really lucky.
So that is true. I had no expectation, no anticipation of catharsis. The word wasn't in my head. I didn't see it in that way. It was just sharing something sweet and beautiful, and yet it turned out to be pure catharsis.
I do feel, Magda Szubanski wrote her really intense and vulnerable memoir. Jimmy Barnes wrote the two of his really traumatic childhood, and I watched them on the circuit selling that book. Jimmy Barnes felt like he'd done a lot of therapy and a lot of work, but Magda still seemed very vulnerable when she was talking about it, and I do think there is a slight concern when people are being so open about themselves.
One of the things for me is it's not fair. You know, all these comics have all this great material. They have these utterly miserable, brutal childhoods. And my childhood was full of ponies and grass and people who were nice to me. I've got nothing. Otherwise, I would be a comedian, right?
There you go. Being a comedian, everything that I do in my group is essentially just ponderances on what my dad and mum and Nana and granddad did. It's just me. Half my shtick is me acting like my bloody dad. Like that's half. It's just another way to get it out.
I was going to ask how much of, what you're trying to work out happens on stage, whether it's a shield or, you said it's ponderances. Is this you trying to work out any emotional stuff, like art as therapy?
Being a comedian, all you're trying to do is take what the funny idea you have in your head and translate that to a big group of people and make them understand. And the easiest gateway to a group of people understanding is parents, because they're pretty much all the same. They all dads sort of they all have that. They're all wearing something daggy. They all have given up on how people think of them usually. So that's the way in with people is their childhood. The show we wrote this year is about high school, and one of the biggest laughs in the show is just we stand in front of the audience and wait for them to stop making noise, because we're about to start this performance and we won't start until everyone's quiet. And then we'll wait as long as we can, and then just as soon as everyone's just as quiet, we go, "It's your lunchtime." And it's something that everyone immediately understands because everyone had the same upbringing.
Yeah. What about you, Paulie, in terms of working things out through art?
It's funny you should say that, because I've been thinking about it in relation to these to this conversation. But the last couple of I've done a lot of things. My life has always been around art, but in the last couple of years I've thrown myself into trying to be, okay, I'm going to be a fine artist the rest of my life if I can pull it off. And I think I have to draw from all the things that I've ever wanted to do or I've ever had in my life and put into my art. And I have words in my art, and I was always sort of conscious of putting words on art. Other people have done it and adding to it, but I try to draw. It's funny to me. I was a Mambo artist originally for years and years and years, and I couldn't draw very well. And they just kept asking me, "Would you be an artist and you do art for us?" And there's Reg Mombas and Richard Allen, all these amazing artists. And I went, "I can't actually draw very well." And none of them geniuses. And I realised that years later they were asking me because I was funny and had jokes. Well, at least I thought I was. But I had jokes and I could say these one-liners and so forth. And that led to a Mambo career. But it sort of led on to my art career, and it's that idea of putting just a couple of words with a picture and even simplifying it right down, Truman Capote, this beautiful writer, concise. I'm not saying anything like him, but just that idea of most simplest sentence, and you add a picture with it, and it becomes something else. I realised, like songwriting, you know, the music, and add some words to it, and it changes everything. And I can do a black dot with, you know, love on it, and people will just see it many different ways. And it's quite a strange thing. You can throw it out there, and people read between the lines and take it on much deeper or funnier than you'd ever expect. And I found it really a great process of getting my work out there. Too nervous to stand on stage and tell jokes, but gags on paper, that's my specialty.
Does everyone here want to be a comedian? Is that what's happening? Because it
Yeah.
seems like Alex and Patrick, are you...
We did a joke about Mambo last night here.
Oh, what was the joke?
Tell us, buddy.
Well, it's like it's a sketch where you're on a phone sex line, but it's someone who gets off on things that aren't sexy, and so it's just, they're like, "What are you wearing?" I'm like, "Oh, I'm just wearing a Mambo t-shirt." It's like,
I'm so over, aren't I? Yeah.
no,
Very rude.
Is it the one where the dog's farting a music note? It's Australian. It's everyone gets it. It's great.
It's funny because it's not
did
true.
that.
Yeah. Oh, did you do that? Wow. That's awesome.
That's something I say because every time we say you're a Mambo artist, people goes, "Oh my God," they want to tell you their favourite shirt story, and it's like everyone's got, "I've still got a Mambo shirt from 19 blah blah blah." It's the one with the like, they don't even listening and go, "I did that." I just every single one. I go, "I did that."
Yeah.
Oh, I see.
They're not listening.
What a
Well,
legacy.
You spoke a little bit about songwriting, and Alex, I want to shock in terms of the personal in the art and catharsis. I know I guess emotional brutality of the marriage equality debate affected a lot of people and the queer community as well. Do you think this, I guess this is a two-part question, was there an expectation on you to make art about that? And did you? And if so, did it help you?
No, I don't feel like there was an expectation. I don't feel like there's an expectation of me to do anything, like, which is the beauty of songwriting and the beauty of, you know, being a musician. I think the moment as an artist, and I'm sure that you can attest to this as well, or even everyone here, like the moment you feel like you're expected to do something or express yourself in a particular way to suit other people's expectations, then automatically the output is somewhat compromised, in my opinion. To speak to the marriage equality debate specifically, I was sort of in a bit of an interesting place. It was actually last time I was at Splendour, which was 2 years ago. I won the Triple J Unearthed spot to play here. And as a result, you know, there was I was sort of experiencing press in the media for the first time, and that was a really interesting thing. And one of the things that my publicist asked me at the time was, you know, how do you feel about talking to, you know, LGBT publications and all that sort of thing? And as someone who has always been a very openly, you know, myself, it was kind of confronting to be conflicted by that question. And it was a really interesting time for me and my identity as, I suppose, like a public figure, you know, in the minuscule sense that it was. And when I was here, I ended up talking to a couple of musicians who were also on the bill named Tegan and Sarah, who are an act from Canada, and they're identical twins, and they both happen to be gay, and have really been pioneers for queer people in the music industry over the last 20 years, and have been people that I've looked up to as a teenager and continue to as well. And while I was here, I met them, and I said to Sarah, I said, look, I'm like in this position at the moment where, you know, I'm being asked about my sexuality, which does not like shape me as a person beyond like my relationships and who I sleep with, basically. And I was like, it's just not that big a deal. I don't know why anyone cares. Like, I don't care about anyone else's, you know, sexuality or preference or who they're with or whatever. It just like so doesn't matter to me. So doesn't matter to my family. Like, it's never been an issue. And she said to me that if I perpetuate the norm that I believe should exist, then the norm will follow. And that was like one of the most significant pieces of advice that I was given. So when the marriage equality debate rolled around, it was an interesting time because my brother was actually getting married, and he's quite a bit younger than me, and was married to my sister-in-law, who he actually hadn't known that long. And, you know, it's wonderful and they're together and it's a beautiful thing. But I thought it was really interesting that he was able to marry, and that was fine, and I was still in a position where I wasn't able to do so. And so I sort of touched on that in the last song in my first record. And I, after years of probably feeling strange about explicitly putting myself out there like that, I really just felt fine with it, because that's what my norm is. And if I perpetuate that, then the norm will follow. And so that was my approach to it.
I feel like, you know, we brought you all here today to talk about the book that brought you back to life, and we haven't talked about that yet, but you've all given me a list of books. And Patrick, I'm going to start with you, if that's okay. Now, you chose a Michael Ondaatje book specifically, and he wins points. You just reread it before the panel, which I hope the rest of you did. Okay.
I had to remember it.
Yeah.
Yes. So I also bought it with him.
And he bought it with him.
Because I am a real
Show
conch. No, it was because I read it last night in my freezing tent. Sort of swapping hands as each one got colder. This was given to me by a girlfriend at university, and I think probably pretty much my experience of literature as an adult has come through all of my relationships. Actually, it's amazing how they have my partners, and there hasn't been that many, and the one I've been with now for 21 years is a writer. Has informed and shaped the way I come to literature. Anyway, this was some time ago when I was at university, and it's about a musician, and I've always been passionate about music, which I guess is why I've ended up working in opera. But it's about a jazz musician, which I'm also passionate about. And what's fascinating about it is that he writes it like a jazz riff. So he actually constructs the narrative in this way, and it's about this real trumpeter who lived at the beginning of the jazz era in New Orleans, and he disappears. He becomes renowned as being this, you know, great musician, but he just disappears, and there's only one photo of him, and so Michael Ondaatje goes and constructs this narrative using this photo to basically, I guess, sort of reinvent the man. But he does it by drawing on all these different strands of narrative, sort of like a jazz improvisation.
So it's the rhythm of the writing.
It's the rhythm of the writing. That's exactly it. Yeah, and I guess for me as an artist, I really responded to it because for me, when I'm putting on a show, I think that a live performance needs to have the energy of a jazz improvisation. I think if the artists are really alive to the moment, like as they are in jazz, and I'm referring to singers and actors, then it creates an energy that you can't otherwise generate. You know, it creates an energy all of its own that is of the moment, and which is what is special about theatre for me. It's that fact that it only happens once.
Why is that the book that brought you back to life? Why was that the first book that came to mind?
Well, I don't know if it brought me back to life, but maybe it woke me up. You know, so that as a 19-year-old, you know, when I was trying to work out what I wanted to be and do, I read this and I thought, yes, this makes sense of the world to me, and this is the sort of artist I want to be. And I mean, the guy ends up drunk and dead, but.
Yay!
and fortunately, I grew out of that. But,
how was it on the reread? Because that's always a risk when you go back to the great passions and you reread them.
Yeah, and I was actually quite scared because when I got the invitation to be here, this was the first book that came to mind, and I looked it up online, and the first thing I got was a review from the New York Times, which just slaughtered it and described it as rubbish. And I thought, oh, Jesus, maybe I missed the mark.
That must have been someone like
was
me
it
writing
you?
that.
They slept through the book. They didn't read it.
Sleep.
Yeah, and Michael Ondaatje, of course, has gone on to have a phenomenal career as a writer, and I think the critic has never been seen again.
Yeah, fuck you, New York Times.
Yeah, fuck you, you critic.
Yeah.
And it's, well, but yeah, reading it again, it was wonderful because it sort of made sense of a lot of the choices that I've made in my life.
That's nice. That's really good.
It's kind of like, it was quite bizarre actually, and sort of reading it and thinking, wow, that some of the ideas in here are things that I've carried with me.
You've implemented as well. Yeah. We when we did the book show, I remember Bob Carr bought Peter Pan as one of his favourite books. Has everyone read Peter Pan? It's an incredibly dark book. I mean, we've sort of grown up with the films and the the cartoon. But the book itself is about, fatherless children, and it's very dark. And we read it, and Jennifer said to Bob, how was it? It was one of his favourite books as a child. How was it rereading? And he said, I didn't reread it. I didn't want to ruin my experience of it from when I was a child. He was never on the show again. He was killed after that moment. But I do think that's interesting when you revisit a text that was a passion for you. I'm so glad it stood the test of time. Paul, when I asked you about the books that gave you life, you gave me a lot of great Robert Crumb sort of counterculture graphic novels, but you also talked about Andy Warhol's diaries. There were 2 different diaries. What is it about diaries of artists that spoke to you?
Well, here it is right here.
Oh, hello.
Which I believe is the thickest book here today. I don't know. I grew up in a country town in New Zealand, and it was very small. And people like Andy Warhol and the Stones and stuff were superstars on the other side of the world. And you didn't know how they got there. They were just guys in wigs. They did amazing pictures. But it's, I think, why we're here now, the forum and TED Talks and so forth. People want to dig deeper and learn about how people's mind. Do you get up and fry eggs before you start work? Do you write 1 hour a day? And this was kind of the precursor to all those. I think it's actually, he wrote 200,000 words and was edited down to this by Pat Hackett, his dear friend. And I've been asked a lot over the years this question, what a book that influenced me, and it's kind of I started reading it the other day going, wow, is this really what changed my life? But it's like it's just kind of bitchy. He's met Bianca, had dinner, got a cab, $7. I don't see what she sees in Mick, stuff like that, and so on and so forth. But the thing I took from it was, and you get into a rhythm of reading every day about what he does. But ultimately, the thing I took from it, that these people did not just stand around looking cool at Velvet's shows and, did one painting of Marilyn. They just did not stop working. Like Picasso, tens of thousands of paintings, probably tens of thousands of works, if not hundreds of thousands of works. And this work ethic that doesn't stop. And I saw Lou Reed talking on, the internet recently, talking about Andy and how much he loved him, and he said every time I saw Andy, and he'd go, "Oh, Lou, how many songs you've written today?" And Lou would go, "I've written 5, Andy." And he'd go, "Lou, you're so lazy, you should have written 10, And this was his ethic of work, and that's what inspired me to think like, wow, you've got to have more than one idea. And I was talking to someone recently about if you want to write a book, you've got to sit down and write a book. There's no getting around it. There's no cheating it. There's no like,
there's no Great Gatsby notes on Google.
Exactly. No. You have to commit. You have to commit your life to that. You have to drop your family for a couple of years. You have to quit work. You have to, eat cup of soup, or paint cans of soup. But that was it's funny rereading. It's like, well, it's actually not that great a read. But what's quite sad. He goes to church. He's quite sad and lonely person. He sits. Some days ago, sat in bed till midday. The phone didn't ring all day. And he's quite a sad person. And then at the end, he's getting near the end, and he's talking about having an operation and stuff. And then went and had lunch with so. Next day, nothing. Dead. He died on an operating. He was dead, on an operating table. He went in for a gallstone operation or something like that, or kidney stones, and it was a minor operation that went wrong. And so it's kind of sad that it ends, and he's quite a sad person.
Oh. So we've got a dead, drunk, sad, bitchy artist. Sarah, when I spoke to you about this, or asked you this question, you actually chose a series of books, or a body of work, as it were.
I've got 2 answers, really, because the truth is, just to go back to the poetry, my heart aches and a drowsy numbness pains my sense, of though of hemlock I had drunk or emptied some dull opiate to the drains 1 minute past and Lethe woods had sunk, or any other 1,000 lines. I say that those are the things that get me out of darkness, and lots of Shakespeare. If you read Hamlet, you can't feel too shit, right? Because Hamlet felt shit too, and that's a long time ago. And so Hamlet and I are kind of brother and sister because we've been through the same thing. So those are the things that... Should we keep talking?
Yeah.
Okay. I've got a broadcast voice. Well, that's good. So very quickly, because what she said was completely crazy, which is that it's poetry, but the other thing that kept me going, the only prose that I could read when I was sad and laid low, is a series of novels about naval battles in the 19th century it's a series of novels about a friendship between a spy and an English naval captain. And it's a beautiful book it's a series of 13 books about friendship and naval battles. And that is the only prose that I can read when I'm sad. Patrick O'Brien. And I can read it and read it and read it and read it and read it over and over and over again. It doesn't matter how many times, I can just keep reading it.
What's the name of the book?
So it starts with Master and Commander, Post Captain, and on from there.
Yeah.
It's brilliant. Jane Austen at Sea.
I was doing Jane Austen at Sea is a good phrase. I was reading about, can you guys hear us okay? Just a little shout as well. About Patrick O'Brien. Near the end of his life, and in the same year he lost his beloved wife, British media revealed details of O'Brien's early life, first marriage and post-war change of name, causing distress to the very private author and to many of his readers at that time, which did make me think about you as a public figure and how much control you get over the narrative. You were talking about before about not wanting to be the story.
Yes, and Patrick O'Brien, I think, also had a life in naval intelligence. So he was someone who played with his own identity was complicated.
Yeah.
But yes, he that idea that after death you are free to liberate someone from the secrets that they have kept all their life, I think is a highly contestable notion.
Yeah. Alex, you've chosen 2 books.
Yeah, I'll talk about one of them maybe.
Okay,
Yeah.
sure, go for it.
So the book that I had in mind is Middlesex by Jeffrey Eugenides, which is it's like a mixture between like a coming of age story and a family, like a intergenerational family saga, which is based around a protagonist who is in the story referred to as a hermaphrodite, but is in fact intersex. And the reason why I really love this book so much is because it encompasses 3 generations of a migrant Greek family living in Detroit, I think, in sort of like the late 20th century, so probably like the 1990s or the 80s, I reckon. But I'm from, like I said before, my mother's Greek, so I was raised by a migrant family, and also like being, it's very much like a queer novel, which is something that that really spoke to me at the time. But it's sort of like the thing about it, I almost feel it was somewhat ahead of its, even though it was published in 2002, I think it was a bit before its time, and really sort of touches on breaking down binaries and trying to categorize people based on, any sort of identity or lack thereof, which is something that I think has only really come to the forefront of, I suppose, common discourse in the last year or two. And it's just such a wonderful book, and you were saying before, like you were talking about the reread. I think rereading books is one thing, but I also think that lending a book to someone close to you and then discussing it after they've read it is even more valuable. And it's one of those books that my band and I do this thing where there's a bookshop in Portland called Powell's, and it's this massive bookstore, and whenever we go into a Portland, we give each other a name of a book and we have to go find it. And every time we do it, I always get someone to find Middlesex, and I think that's why it's such an important book to me.
What happens though, you know how when you give a friend a book with trembling hands and you're like, you are going to love this, what happens if and when they don't love it? How does that affect the friendship?
I reckon it's almost a better discussion in a way, like, having, there's something so beautiful about discussing art in that the only two outcomes that you have is agreeing with someone or agreeing to disagree, which I think is like a really cool part about discussing art and music and film and all that sort of stuff.
If you're free to discuss it, I think there are some books for me and other pieces of art that I don't think a friendship can recover from. So someone who doesn't like Flat Stanley, I'm just not going to there are a few threshold books.
Yeah, I agree
not
with
many,
you as
but
well.
a few.
No, there are some tattooed on your soul, and I remember a friend gave me, and it was tattooed on her soul, Life of Pi. I didn't like Life of, I'm sorry everybody, but it's the friendship's been a little strained ever since, because she looked at me very hopefully, like,
and I love it.
Wasn't it amazing?
I think there's and I speak about this in relation to bands as well. I think that they're with musicians and bands, I always say that there are some artists that are so good. If you told me that they weren't good, you're wrong.
Yeah.
You just don't
Yeah.
like it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, you know, I don't like Coldplay, but they're a good band, you
Yeah.
know, like it's sort of, it's like stuff like that. And I think that, you know, like to go back to Lion Witch in the Wardrobe, like I think it just becomes a matter of opinion as opposed to an actual judgment on the quality of the art itself.
No, but something like The Light Between the Oceans is just bad. Like, I can't hear arguments about that. That's a terrible book. I'm sorry, that's my campaign, is so everyone realises what a fucking terrible book that was. I know it did fine, they made a movie, like, it doesn't matter what I say about it, but I turn that around in bookshops when I'm there. That person doesn't need any more
I'm
money.
the same with Eyes Wide Shut. There's
You
just
turn
no
the-
way you can know the film. There's
Oh,
just like
okay.
there's just no way that's a masterpiece by a brilliant director. It's a pile of rubbish.
Speaking
You
of,
know, actually, my husband tells me not to fiddle with books in bookstores. I do it all the time.
Yeah.
I move the bad books around.
Yeah.
It's not moving my own
Yeah.
books or my friends' books.
yours up the front.
And he just says, you can't do that.
No, you fucking
Someone's going to
can.
see you.
No.
Someone's going to see you, and they're going to say you're doing it because you're moving your book to the
No.
top. No. I'm just getting rid of the bad books.
Yeah.
we
Yeah,
are
my
the-
job-
we
There's
are
no
the
bookstores
revolution.
anymore.
Yeah.
I just be wandering around the grass talking about a time that people don't remember.
No, I think
Fahrenheit
we're the
450.
quiet resistance. Turn
Yeah.
the fucking books around. The people
Yeah.
don't deserve it. Not the good ones. We're going to speak about masterpieces because Broden, we want to talk about the book that brought you back to life. Now, you did mention it briefly before. Would you like to speak of it again?
The Rock says the autobiography of The Rock, which is the first book I ever finished. And you might be thinking, oh, well, it might be interesting. It might be about when The Rock became a billionaire making movies. No, it was written when he was just a wrestler. Well, maybe it's going to give a real truthful glimpse of what it's like to be a wrestler and how awful it is and how they're all on steroids. No, it's produced by the WWF, so it's just propaganda. Does it give you a real glimpse of The Rock, a real personal relationship with him? It was written by a shadow writer. I read it when I was 11. Some fun facts, because I was going to read it again like you read your favourite book. You can't find this book anymore. It's not online. There's not Amazon doesn't really have it, but 95% of Google users like the book. And but it was the reason I brought it up is because I thought it'd be funny, and I'm the funny guy on the panel, and because it's the first time I ever finished a book, and I'll never forget the sensation of finishing a book. And for me, at that time in my life, I've felt it's a memory I've had forever. The reward of finishing a book, and it was that one. Yeah,
Dwayne The Rock Johnson.
Dwayne The Rock Johnson.
Now, we're getting closer to time. I'm open to, did you guys want to ask questions? We can keep talking, or did you have questions you want to ask? Because we can open it up to Q&A as long as you're not dicks. Like, people are often in Q&As, you have to be nice. But did anyone have questions that they wanted to ask? Did you want me to leave time for questions? We're all in this together. There's no mics. We're in the room together. We're in a book club. We're friends now. Any thoughts or questions, or you just want us to keep chatting? Oh, there's a question down the front. Okay, yeah.
So, do any of you find you fall into a lull where you stop reading for weeks or months at a time? And is there something that gets you back into a break of reading again?
So the question for those of you at the back that might not be able to hear, it's do any of us fall into a great question. She's an investigative Walkley Award-winning question, I think. Do any of us fall into a lull or a rut where we don't read for weeks or months at a time, and is there something that would inspire us again? Has anyone got an answer for that?
Well, this actually goes back to your question about reading or books or art getting you out of a time of crisis. For me, as a songwriter, crisis is like prime time. Like that's hey.
Crisis is prime time! Yay!
Like me,
I don't know if our mics are back on, but we'll just keep chatting.
But every time I have a relationship breakdown or anything like that, I'll tell my manager and he's like, sick, let's do it. And it's really funny. My partner's a songwriter as well, and she tends to write as the crisis is happening and when she's in the thick of it. For me, I need space and distance from it, which means that during that time of turbulence, I go into total absorption, which also means that I tend not to consume art at all. And it's just sort of about, and this is something that is not conscious and is only something that I've sort of been able to identify in the last 12 months or so. but I tend to just not really consume any literature or music or film, and I really struggle to do so. And the thing that gets me back into it is when I start creating myself. And the moment that it's almost like a validation thing, like the moment I feel like valid that I've turned this, animosity or situational time of change in my life into, output that I'm really proud of and that I've experienced a catharsis from it, is when I kind of feel comfortable again starting to consume art.
That idea, though, is what, suffering, making great art, you having a breakdown, your mum dying, people burning in operas and your bad dad. It's like, is it work coming from bad situations?
Yeah, I think also, like, when you use that word crisis before, like, I interpreted that, like, I write songs about happy things too, and sometimes I feel that those, like, intense periods of emotion on either side of the spectrum just come from change, and that's like where I sort of get my inspiration from. And so when you say crisis, I think change. Yeah.
And you're talking about something slightly different, which is a lull, a reading break, and then you can even start to feel a little bit guilty that you've let your reading slip. And I do the same thing, which is to go back to books that I've read before that are really familiar, and like I did as a child, reading and rereading the same books over and over and over again. If I go back to something that I know really well, and that opens the door back to the rest of literature for me. That's how I do it.
I was in a reading lull in a book. I was in writer's block and really struggling to write new comedy, and it was a book that brought me out of that. I've been in a writing lull. It was Mike Birbiglia's book Sleepwalk With Me, which is pretty much, it's not extraordinary in a lot of ways. It's just a recollection of a comedian's life, girlfriends, parents. It's extraordinary, and it's the funniest book that I've ever read. And I laughed at one joke in the book for 5 minutes, and to this day it's the funniest book I've ever read, and made me want to go back and start writing in different ways. So huge for me.
How many people still read books as opposed to reading?
I'm mostly on an iPad.
50-50.
50-50. I thought I thought I would never read electronically because paper books have been such an enormous part of my life. I didn't think it would happen. It did. Yeah. So both.
Another question I had for a writer, a friend of mine recently, I said, when do you read? Exactly when?
And what was the answer?
She said, well, she's very specifically, she's not married, doesn't have kids and stuff, doesn't have busy schedule, but makes those hours, specifically she writes when she makes, I'll read from 5 to 7, every day or whatever. But for the average person, it's a question. It's like, when do you have that moment you can actually read a book? Or...
Do you know who one of the biggest enemies of books in the whole of Australia is? Tony Abbott. And you want to know why? Oh, no. Just because I wanted to say his word. But because he says every man is king in his own car, because he doesn't like public transport. And public transport is a place for books. I know people read fewer, a little bit less than they did. Yeah. But I was talking to virtually all my friends have lost their driving licenses at one point or another recently, because New South Wales is a police state, right, when it comes to driving. So hardly anybody's got a license anymore. So all my friends are at some point or another back to public transport. And on public transport, they find they read much more than they did when they were zooming around in their cars.
Yes, but most people in public transport these days, you see, they're here.
True. It's a wider problem, but you can. It is if you get back into the habit of reading books.
Hooray! Thank you for your patience.
Of the Lambs. I lived in Paris. I lived in Paris for a long time. I lived in Paris for a long time, and I was only reading in French. And then every now and again, I'd let myself read a book in English, and I would read it in one great gulp. So I'd either sit in the bath and read a whole book, or I'd read Silence. So I had 3 books. I had one Philip Roth, I had Silence of the Lambs, and some thriller. Can't remember, and some other book. And I just read them. I allowed myself to read them cheekily, and I would just get on the bus, get on the metro and read Silence of the Lambs, and then go back to reading in bloody French again.
And you read in the bath, so you're happy with soggy pages?
Absolutely, because it was a pretty trashy book.
Personal question.
Do you reheat though?
Sorry?
You put hot on for a while, like
Look, you know, keep topping
Topping
it up.
the bathtub.
And you know,
Okay,
you know what
that's
Paris
good.
bathtubs are like? You know,
Yeah.
they're only as big as this.
Yeah.
So you're basically in the bath like this. And I could stay there for hours reading. It was on the farm. It was Updike. Sorry, on the farm, Silence of the Lambs, and a trashy book.
Are there any other questions there before we... Yes? Oh, we've got
the box
there's this
now, we got
amazing
it.
orange just on the front here, if that's okay.
Ooh, what's
This
that?
amazing orange box that you catch.
Woo. Not quite.
What do you do with it? Oh, you can yell it out as well. Coming.
I just want to ask a question about what you read and then what you write, the difference. So I'm a horror writer, but I don't read horror. I read kind of just general kind of fiction, a lot of classics, but then everything that I get published is all horror. So I was just wondering if there was, the songwriting of your writing or what you read, if there's a complete difference if you consume something that's completely different from what you create.
Could you guys hear that question? No. Yes, no? Oh, it's mixed response. Just about if you're a writer in a specific genre, you're a horror writer, but you don't read any horror. And I guess for all of us, do we read the sort of things we write? Do we, do we stick with genre or, yeah?
Even just with creating, do you create something completely different than what
If
you
you're
consume?
creating something different, yeah.
Yeah.
Comedy's definitely is homework for me. Like, having to sit through specials and things like that is definitely awful when you're trying to write comedy. But it's also super important. Other journalism, do you...
I don't read a lot of, I don't really like journalist memoirs because I know other people do, but I don't like journalists talking about themselves. So I don't read other journalists talking about their life as journalists, but I do read non-fiction. But I think it's a really interesting question, is staying away from your own genre. I had a very close friend, again, this is one of the things that my mother threw away, is an English poet called Glenn Maxwell, who I knew closely when I was a teenager. And when he was doing English at Oxford and starting to become a bit of an emerging poet in Britain, he didn't read anything. He got a first in English at Oxford. He's a brilliant poet, and he didn't read because he didn't want anything disturbing his poetry. Pretty full on. He also wrote his finals essay about Othello, and the entire last paragraph was in parenthesis, and it was a page long. The guy's a genius, but he didn't read.
Martin Amis is like that when he's writing. I know he doesn't read any other writers because he starts writing like them. He doesn't realise that he starts subconsciously absorbing
Songwriters
them.
do that. It's the thing,
Yeah.
you go, wow, I've written a great song. It's like, well, it's exactly the same as Satisfaction by the Stones or something, right? The greatest riff in the world.
Well, what
Not saying
about
you are.
that's that interesting? 'Cause that makes me think about what happens when you read someone or listen to someone with a really distinctive style when you're young, and it sticks. So I got into Gertrude Stein for a while, who has a very particular style, as I'm sure most of you know. And then I started writing in this awful facsimile Gertrude Stein style. It lasted for about 5 years. It was garbage. And I just couldn't get rid of this very pretentious version of Gertrude Stein, who I became for those few years in my writing style. Took years to clean it out of the system.
Take home here is don't read anything.
Yes,
I think
read
is what we
nothing.
all want to take from today. We're running out of time. There was a question up the back. Was I right? Yes. Catch the weird orange box. There we go.
Are you discarders or persisters when you pick up a book?
Oh, that's a good
Great
question.
question. That's the
And it's
three
not-
best book
Three
questions
And it's
ever.
not directed at Paul at all.
No. Okay, well, we'll start going this way around, Sarah.
Okay, so I'm a shocking discarder, and I've just been on holiday, and my husband decided I have discarded Ulysses 36 times, and the bastard read all of Ulysses and just made me feel totally awful because
That's
I
a
discarded.
passive-aggressive act, I think.
Awful.
You know,
So
yeah.
discard. Weak. I'm weak.
I used to have discarders guilt for a long period of my life. But now I feel like I've accepted the act, especially now that, life is busy and, having the time to sit down and read is such a treat. I want it to be like a fucking good time. So I think if I'm reading something and I'm not too into it, then I'll probably put it down and start the next thing. Just because it is like, as I'm sure it is for a lot of us here, we connect to reading so much because more as adults, because it is such a sacred time during our day or our week or whenever we can pick it up. Discard all the way.
Patrick?
I'm a persister, and that might have something to do with the fact that I work in opera, because I'll often be sitting in an opera and think, holy shit, when's this going to finish? And there is a certain reward when you do stick it out, but I do sometimes take a year to read a book, but I'll have 5 or 6 going at once.
Yeah, I'm a persister too. Even if I don't like it, I'll angry read it to the end. I'll be
Same.
like, fuck you, you're wasting my time, but I'll finish. You're the same,
That's
Paul.
persister hater,
Yeah,
and you just
yeah.
go like, this isn't very good. This is shit. This is really
Yeah.
shit, but you need to really tell
Were
everyone about
were
it.
you persisters well behaved at school? Were you good? No?
No.
The
No
Mambo
correlation?
guy.
I was a bad kid.
Yeah. But you're a
Broden?
persister.
Smoking.
Broden?
Shameless discarder.
You're a
I get a
discarder?
page in and I fucking throw it.
Oh, really? You're a thrower.
Oh, yeah. Broken windows everywhere in Broden.
I'm going to finish. Thank you for those amazing questions. We're running out of time. I'm sure if you find any of these lovely people around the traps, they'll talk books with you. That's my favourite thing to do with people. Paul won't. He's shaking his head.
Oh.
Everyone else will. They're all very generous. I want to quickly just go around and talk. Just if you can tell us what you're reading right now. I'm sure everyone would love to know.
Okay,
Sarah?
so it's so unfair because it's going to sound so crap compared to Andy Warhol's diaries. Right now, I'm reading a history of the cantons in China. So reading about Chinese imperialism. Sorry,
There's a lot of
Patrick O'Brien and the naval battles because I'm always reading them as well. But I'm reading about
There's
China.
a lot of self-judgment and apology going on that we need to talk about. Sarah will talk about it backstage, but
Yeah,
you're
I'm a
not weak
Splendour.
and you shouldn't be
I'm
sorry.
at Splendour. I'm not at the Jaipur Writers Festival. I'm at Splendour. I've got to have a better answer than
No,
the
you
history
don't.
of the cantons
The truth
in
is
China.
your answer, Sarah.
Shit.
Alex, what are you reading?
At the moment, I'm reading a book that I actually picked up at Powell's in Portland when I was last there on tour, and it's Timbuktu by Paul Auster.
Oh, gorgeous. That's a gorgeous book. Patrick?
I've got 3 on the go at the moment. One is Camus' essay called Create Dangerously, which is beautiful. And one is by, I forget, the guy who was the lover of, it's set in New York, and he
Bill
yeah,
Hayes.
yeah.
Well
Oliver
done,
Sacks.
geez.
The lover of Oliver Sacks.
That was amazing.
It's a beautiful
It's
book.
such a beautiful book.
Yeah.
I would recommend it highly. Really beautiful book. And then I'm reading the diaries of Sir Peter Hall, who was one of the great theatre opera directors of the last 100 years.
Gorgeous.
Yep.
Paul?
I'm reading quite an odd one, I think, which is not odd really. It's popular. Sarah Wilson's First We Unleash the Beast,
Oh, yeah.
which is got a lot of darkness and a lot of answers and questions for people.
Yeah.
I'm reading John Safran's Depends on What You Mean by Extremism.
Are you enjoying it?
Yeah, or as much as you can.
Yeah.
Very frustrating book.
It is quite frustrating and quite intense.
It's about the alt-right movement in Melbourne and the protests, anti-Islam protests. And but it's a very important book and very interesting.
What are you reading?
Well, I'm going to talk about what I just finished reading because I think everyone should read it, which is Maria Tamarkin's Axiomatic, which is one of the greatest books I've ever read, let alone one of the greatest books this year. It's going to win everything. It's an incredible book of essays about trauma, and make yourself safe when you're reading it because it's pretty intense, but it's a staggering piece of writing and I can't recommend it more highly. Thank you so much for joining us for our first ever Saturday morning Splendour Book Club. It's very nice of you to wake up. Keep clapping for Sarah, Alex, Patrick, Paul, Broden. I'm Marieke. Have a wonderful Saturday. Bye, everyone.
Bye.